What's up, film fans? Hope you're all doing well. Today on the agenda is Game of Death. That's the 1978 version we're talking about today. So what I intend to do here is this. I don't think this video is going to run too long because, to be honest with you, I don't have that much, at least positive, to say about the 1978 version of Game of Death, really. And then the next video is going to be, which probably is going to be maybe the final in this series on Bruce Lee. I imagine will be on the final Game of Death, which is the Arrow Video exclusive of the 4-hour footage, plus the assembled 40 minutes or so cut of the footage that Lee intended. So that will be for next video. That will be the kind of finale, if you like, I imagine. Unless I do commit to doing Game of Death 2. Still haven't decided yet. But for all intents and purposes, this video is focusing anyway on the 78 version of Game of Death, which I first saw when I was a kid because they showed it in the same season on Channel 4 with all the other Lee films. And me being a child, I didn't understand or realise that this wasn't a kind of official Bruce Lee film. Because what complicates matters in the 78 version of Game of Death is they repurposed the footage that Lee shot for the Game of Death, the film of the same, with the same title. It was going to be it was the working title at least. And then they shoehorn it and kind of crowbar it and butcher it into the rest of the film, which doesn't feature Lee, but also repurposes his footage from his other films. It's quite a complicated film to talk about just from that sense, in the sense that the 1978 version of Game of Death is inherently kind of intertextual and metatextual, because essentially what you have is, not even attempting to re-describe the plot is, or relay the plot, I should say, is pretty difficult. Essentially, you have a character called Billy Lowe, who's kind of meant to be, well, obviously he's meant to be Bruce Lee, right? Because it opens with actual footage from Way of the Dragon, the final fight scene between Chuck Norris and Bruce Lee, and then that's our way of that's our kind of way of being introduced to the character of Billy Lowe, even though it's Bruce Lee. But anyway, and then the plot essentially is this actor Billy Lowe is essentially he's attempted this criminal gang is attempted to extort him to participate in this fight tournament essentially, and he refuses, and so their attempts to extort him get more and more extreme. They try and drop a set light on him on the set of The Way of the Dragon, even though of course it isn't really. And then they ambush him, beat him up. And this is kind of the actual only scene that you could say in a Bruce Lee film in which Bruce Lee loses a fight, actually, but considering it's not really Bruce Lee. So the doubles for Bruce Lee in this film are played by like 3 different actors. I suppose because not one guy can capture all the mannerisms and skills, and the 3 of them still aren't capable of doing so. Of course, it's kind of impossible to replicate him. He's one of a kind from that aspect, isn't he? He's very distinct, Bruce, in his skills and his mannerisms. But it takes 3 different actors anyway, and so he's beaten up by this gang, and then that isn't enough. So what they do then is an attempted assassination on the set of what is meant to be the end of Fist of Fury. They kind of recreate and again repurpose that scene. All of this is done basically as an excuse to use as much Bruce footage as they can without it seeming too, I suppose, forced, so they can get away with not hiding the fact that this is clearly old Bruce Lee footage, if that makes sense. It's a very lazy and cynical attempt to do so. But we essentially get him shot in the face. He doesn't die. But Billy Lowe fakes his own death whilst having reconstructive surgery on the damage that's done to his face, so then he can undergo several disguises to take down this gang that has essentially attempted to kill him. He has a girlfriend in this film played by Colleen Camp. And this is what's very weird about this film, is you can kind of draw a direct line between the American side of it, production and influence, and the Cantonese Hong Kong side of it. So it's very much a film of, I don't want to say of 2 halves, because all of it's a kind of massive mess. As you can tell, my attempt to even describe the plot is in of itself convoluted, right? And The reason being is because they have to come up with these extravagant excuses and explanations within the plot to justify the footage of Lee. So it is all but a Bruceploitation movie, but in name, essentially. Just because they attach former talents that worked with Lee, such as like Robert Klaus directs the '78 version of Game of Death, right? Who directed Enter the Dragon. Bob Wall is an actor that's used in this, who was present in both Way of the Dragon and Into the Dragon. Of course, Raymond Chow helped produce it. So there's this kind of clout to the movie that other Bruceploitation movies wouldn't have. But that doesn't mean that this is any less problematic. In fact, I think it's more problematic because of that. Because it's even more of a kind of morally dubious and reprehensible film, because you literally have people that worked with and collaborated and knew Bruce Lee taking part in this, which I think is the biggest sin, right? It's not just like it's a Bruceploitation movie made by some outside kind of imitator or something. This is people that actually knew and worked with him. They can use the excuse of, oh, we're finishing off his film, but they take the footage that he shot, butcher it by including some bits and not others, shoehorn it into a plot that Lee never intended, on the basis essentially as a cynical exercise in making profit. It's kind of one of the most, like I say, morally dubious films I've ever watched from that standpoint. In fact, I would say it's probably one of the few films that in the past I probably rated, like in my head I rated 1 out of 10, because for me it has very little redeeming features at all. The fight scenes themselves, if you take them out of context, I'm including the ones that Lee didn't shoot here, so the fight scenes that are interspersed throughout the film, and they change depending on which version of this you're watching, because believe it or not, there's 4 different versions of this film on the Arrow set. There's the international version, the Japanese version, that's on 1 disc of the first slipcase, and then which I've got here. So you've got Game of Death, alternate versions, and alternate versions of the Cantonese and Mandarin versions. Now, I grew up watching the Cantonese cut of the film, so that's kind of like the cut that I really watched for this, which essentially includes it. At the time I didn't realize this, but the greenhouse fight scene, right? Which again, if you take these fight scenes out of their, isolate them out of their context, they're pretty, and they're entertaining, well done fight scenes. They're not very Bruce Lee fight scenes, even though they try and make it look like one. Obviously, Billy Lowe is played by Bruce Lee, supposedly. So they try, but the fight scenes in terms of their storytelling and their construction do not emulate the structure and style and form of what Bruce Lee would shoot, for example. And you can see this even in how it's night and day between that and the Bruce Lee scenes we did get in the end of the film, which essentially is the fight scene with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Again, depending on the version you watch, you might get some of the Danilo Santo fight, and which is the fight with the kind of the Eskrima sticks and the nunchakus. Again, it's hard to describe this without talking about the original Game of Death. So, the original Game of Death, as Lee had intended, is essentially was essentially a plot that revolved around Bruce ascending this pagoda and essentially fighting people of different fight styles, and he shot the final 3 floors of this, floor 3, 4, and 5. Floor 3 being his fight with Danilo Santo, 4 with being a kind of, I think he's Korean, but Hapkido Grandmaster, and 5 being Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who practiced Jeet Kune Do like Bruce. So he ascends these levels and has to fight different styles. What we get in the '78 version of Game of Death is you get the Kareem Abdul-Jabbar fight, but it's in the context of he's a villain for this criminal organization, and he's called Hakim, and it's not the full scene, so you don't get the whole context, for example, of why Hakim wears glasses, and actually that's a hindrance to him in the real intended fight scene that Lee shot. Essentially, that he's got he's kind of blind or half blind, which as a kid I never understood, right? Because if you watch the fight scene in the Cantonese version of Game of Death, for example, which is what I grew up with, it's like halfway through the fight scene, I'm like going, as a child, I'm like, I swear, like he's playing someone who's like got half vision or something. You know, he all of a sudden can't see, or he's obscure, his vision's obscured somewhat. That only makes sense, of course, if you actually see the full uncut fight scene with Kareem and Bruce. So, like I said, it's a bit of a mess, this film, and as such, it's very hard to even talk about in a kind of structured manner. Um, what's interesting is, so the Cantonese version I grew up with didn't so it had the greenhouse scene, but it had the unhappy endings. There's two endings, the two main endings to this film. There's the unhappy ending where Billy Lowe's character gets arrested because for his actions as a form of retribution, kind of like to suit, I suppose, conservative audience taste at the time, right? The hero must be punished for crossing the line of killing people. Okay, I got that on the Cantonese version, but the Cantonese version on the Arrow video set has the happy ending where he leaves on the ferry with his partner. So I'm not quite, and I also get the extra scenes where with Bruce Lee, with Billy Lowe in the old man's disguise, and he goes to the restaurant to fight the Hapkido master in the middle of the film. So he pays 2 visits to the restaurant, which I never saw when I was a kid. It was just he goes to the restaurant at the end of the film after the American villain Stick tells him where they are, and then he fights there. Of course, Hakim, who's Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's character in this, and Steiner, who's played by another American actor, and then he confronts the boss at the end, who kind of dies at his own hands, really falling off the roof, right? But so I can enjoy this film now almost ironically in the fact of how bad it is, almost like kind of so bad it's good. It's one of those kind of ironic enjoyment movies, like to put maybe alongside the Room or something being a really famous example, right? But I don't really have many positive, like actual sincere positives of this film, apart from one, which is the score. The score by John Barry, I think, is great. John Barry is one of my favourite film composers, and it's kind of quite incredible that they got him to do this. What's even more ironic is, of course, that they took, let's be honest, probably without license and whatnot, and without permission, almost certainly, they took some of Barry's scores and cues to use in the prior Golden Harvest Bruce Lee films. But here, John Barry does the full score really for Game of Death, and I think it's great. John Barry, of course, most notable for doing all the James Bond scores from Doctor No, so it's 1962, all the way to Living Daylights, which is the first Timothy Dalton Bond, 1987. So for about 25 years. He didn't do the scores for Live and Let Die and Spy Love Me, but he did all those James Bond scores. So and I grew up loving James Bond as well. So John Barry naturally being one of my favourite film composers, I think that's the highlight of the film for me, is I do actually like the score. And I suppose the most... The problem, like I say, the purpose of this film is to cynically exploit the stardom of Lee for profit. That it's not a sincere functioning tribute or anything like that. It's not a sincere attempt to reconstruct or finish the film that Lee had intended at all, because the plot resembles nothing to do with what Lee had intended, and the fight scenes are repurposed even in a way that betrays the narrative storytelling elements that were in the fight scenes. So you get none of that conveyed in the 78 version of Game of Death. And probably the most odious aspect of this film, of course, is the incorporation of the footage of Lee's own funeral, which is just, as a kid, kind of disturbed me on a level of like, that looks so much like Bruce, but it doesn't look like him, because of course, if you've ever seen a dead person, there's that mix, right, of like, they seemingly look like the person that you've known, but then they also don't. Is that uncanny element there. And so it really confused me and threw me as a kid of like, I swear that's actually Bruce, and it looks quite convincing, and what's going on here? And of course, when I've realised when I got older that, hey, these are insert shots from older Bruce Lee movies, and hey, the background of that shot doesn't match the rest of the action in the other shot, and hey, what, just that's clearly not Bruce Lee. Like, it took me a couple of years as a kid to realize that, and again, some of them is poor attempts at disguise. I mean, they even used a cardboard cutout of Lee in the dressing room scene at one point, the dressing room scene, and kind of hold it up over the double of Lee, essentially. It's just, it's really poor, right? It's really poor filmmaking. It's just a desperate attempt to cash in on the curiosity and the fascination with obsession with Lee post his death. And it worked, right? I think Game of Death was a success in a way. But it is it's an awful film, really, not to be taken seriously. So I can't. That's why I can enjoy it ironically, because even though its intentions are like really slimy, I you kind of just have to not overlook it, but just, I mean, it is what it is, unfortunately. So, and that's kind of like one of the reasons why I don't really want to have to watch Game of Death 2, really, because that's got even more, even less footage of Liam, right? Because at least this tries to have, as a kid, the main reason you watch this is because you see Bruce in the yellow tracksuit, and you're like, well, that wasn't in any of the previous Lee films, so is there a missing film here somewhere? As it turns out, there's partially a missing film, right? Which did emerge in the early 2000s. John Little, the Lee biographer, did manage to put together a kind of cut of the film, 40 minutes of the footage, and even filmed some scenes beforehand to give some context based upon Lee's notes and storyboards that he did have. And there is an interesting book on this called, I think the documentary slash film is called A Warrior's Journey, and the book's had the same title. It was a really interesting book. I don't have it anymore. I sold it, unfortunately. I do regret doing that, but yeah, I sold it at the time. So that's all I really have to say about Game of Death. Really, I suppose it's a kind of like fascinating curio for kind of Lee fans, and I'm glad it is in the set, because it's nice to actually see. There was a bit of a nostalgia factor for me seeing the Cantonese version again, and ironically enjoying it as an adult. But it is kind of an awful piece of trash, really. And I can enjoy John Barry's score in isolation. I mean, it's on Spotify or other platforms, for example. You can like buy a copy of it. So that's all. Yeah, like I said, that's all I really have to say. Maybe some of you out there are more glowing or positive in your experience of, or even now your appreciation of Game of Death. The '78 version, of course, I must stress, I'm separating this from the stuff that Bruce shot and intended, which we'll cover next time, which is definitely has a lot more positives. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this one. It's a bit of a shorter one, which I'm kind of glad, and I hope you've been enjoying the series so far. Thanks to you, by the way, those of you that have commented and subscribed. It's actually been really, really nice, actually, to read the experiences of fellow Lee fans, and also just have some nice feedback. Actually, I'm really taken aback and surprised by like how well it's gone, and how much some of you have enjoyed it. So I really do appreciate that. And join me for the probably what is the last one in the series, which is where we look at the final Game of Death, aptly titled perhaps. But yeah, I hope you all have a good day, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.